Hello everyone, today we talk about San Martin of Tours, Martinus in Latin, which means of Mars himself. Do you know what did Saint Martin do for a living? This is not just about the broader category of military saints, so former soldiers that, for the reasons we'll explain now, interpreted, let's say, the relation with God in a more sort of detachedly spiritual sense, which is already quite meaningful, and it is actually very recurrent for some of the greatest warriors of different eras. Here we're talking about an elite eques cataphractarius of the Schole Palatine of Emperor Julian. I don't know if you have, a quite tepid idea of what this actually means. It basically means that you belong to the single most elite unit ever, with the most elite specialization ever. These were people that for a living slaughtered hundreds of people by their own hand. There should be an enormous premise to this video, which I will, skip, because we will see it better in other Christian history videos. But we've already seen in other context that, one, there is no evidence whatsoever, and San Martin actually goes close to that, at least in the hagiographical narrative of his story, which is also a different thing from what we can expect the real history went down like, concerning the notion that Christian soldiers could not spill blood. Because first of all, they would have not been soldiers to begin with. Secondly, there is no explicit evidence whatsoever in the broader background, of course, of Christian support towards the Roman Empire, which was much more frequent and generalized by magnitudinal scale at any moment like the ones of the persecution, in which probably Christians were, if anything, just the subject, recipient of that violence, of that imposition, that were, however, also responsible for, to the degree they refused to recognize the emperor as a divine being. Some perfectly Catholic bishops simply stated, okay, well, you can sacrifice, then you will atone later. It's not this huge deal. But some Christians, out of freedom of conscience, simply got themselves martyrized in the process. I have a pretty wide playlist dedicated to Christian history and sort of whereabouts, also in political, military, social terms, the relation with the empire. This is something that people get wrong all the time. It's as if all our philosophical, religious, theological thought was starting from this Gnostic heresy that somehow started permeating historiography of essentially Christianity as some sort of alien, completely detached belief from any kind of background, starting from the European one to the previous, in fact, Catholic beliefs that were the foundation, in fact, of in the European and other traditional cultures, universality. Yesterday I made a video explaining that to some depth. And then, a complete opposition between this irreconcilability, people from any kind of weird background trying to vent their own, failure as people, being mortal and human, towards like a hatred towards Christianity or the other way around for that matter. We still have people using the term paganism, polytheism, and literally thinking that this is religious history. But let's even skip that for a moment. The second point, that not even the hagiography can simply readapt. For example, here, as we'll see, San Martin decides not to be an earthly soldier, so to say, anymore. It's actually a very complex theological issue. We will essentially expand on this abundantly in this video. I don't premise anything. Namely, the very information that this was not a generic soldier, but it was basically the ultra-elite of the greatest military machine in the world at the time, especially in places like Gaul, from Pannonia, by the way, and under someone like Julian, that we also made some videos about, not just destroyed, as we will see, and this is very climatic for St. Martin's own spiritual journey, the Alammani, and then also died in an otherwise successful campaign, having been, in fact, for his own death in the east against Persia. And we'll come back on the 4th century Roman army, the Constantinian one, because it's something so underrated, it's unbelievable. We will read better now what the geography says to understand the extent by which, indeed, Sulpicius Severus recorded, with this, again, sense of meeker attitude towards life, this sort of withdrawal from the secular that is very psychologically fitting most social strata at the time. It's definitely not the military that, as you know, from especially the age of Diocletian, had become not just more sort of hierarchically stratified, but in a sense very, very professional at the top. And so with a direction that is even, you can argue, part of feudal in the at least medieval horizon of the knight and so on. And here, literally, we're looking at an equus cataphractarius, right? So what the Romans basically developed after the Iranian tradition of the steppe of the Middle East. Admittedly, Roman cataphracts were not very performing. It's not like they weren't good, ideally, but apparently the Romans didn't really ever score major hits with that. Even at the Battle of Strasbourg against the Alammani, they basically got overrun by, admittedly, a combined armed force of infantry and cavalry of much lighter type. But aside from the obviously absolutely high standards of the Roman army, here we're looking also at the individual as such. And today's video delves mostly into the spiritual meaning of this all. It's naturally very difficult with late antique sources, especially of this kind, right? And this is actually generalized at all levels of society. Let's leave aside peoples that didn't even write, but in Rome, in the empire at large, there's a courtly literature that dominates, panegyrics, sort of encomia, et similia. The Christian world spreads these hagiographical tales that are incredibly rich and loaded. It's always heavily disturbing when you hear these things about, the Christians simply not just destroyed, which is true to an extent, the previous world's knowledge, even admitting that, by the way, by the time of late antiquity, with the massive moral and material collapse of every people in the world, everywhere, including and actually especially at the outskirts, and more adherent belief to the origins. And this is actually why Christianity comes about, not as a cause, but as a consequence. In fact, also this hagiography is quite eloquent, but also, as we're just saying, presenting from the authors of the ecclesiastical background this more sort of sheltered perspective, one that definitely was not the one of the Miles. Of course, had Martin written himself his own story, probably we would hear something very different. But as we know, also from medieval sources, it's very rare, especially up to the later Middle Ages, to even hear at any point a knight talking about his own exploit or telling us how he saw the world, the meaning of properly of the militia, not just the militia Christi, but literally the meaning of the cingulum militaris and the proper monastic, or even when this was actually not a monastic order properly meant, but experienced that chivalric initiation training preparation really entailed as a whole, right? We have a massive amount of hints scattered all over. We also know later from other authors in, again, increasingly secularizing, modernizing times, much about the whole picture, so that it's not really strange to look at it, even for the previous eras. But this is exactly the problem. There are very few scholars and people in general that get interested in this simple combo. Also for broader sub-social cultural reasons nowadays, namely the fact that who studies warfare and stuff does not care much about ecclesiastical history, which means you're going to remain hopelessly ignorant in both, and that even the generalized understanding of religion nowadays is the one of a hamster brain kind of pseudo-intellectual development, whereby, again, people think that, studying religious history is boring, studying history of the church, of geography, and missing the traumatically deep, anthropologically speaking, not just religiously, like literally, just a work like the one of Sulpicius Severus speaks volumes if you are able to combine it with, for example, a sense of the Imperial Catholic tradition and what does St. Martin's lives and deeds actually mean. All right. But back to the man, because this is exactly what we're looking at today. Most of what we know about St. Martin comes from the hagiography of Sulpicius Severus. All right. Martin of Tours was not born in Tours. Was for a reason, obviously, like he took the name after when he was in Gaul, but he was born in, and we don't know, either 316 or 336, not even in between, like either for ideological reasons that now we don't have time to digress on, in Savaria, Pannonia. It would be modern-day Szombathely, Hungary, right? So these areas, historically, we tend to imagine them as not actually much, to tell you the truth, they're not popular areas, because we haven't enucleated much the fact that these were, first of all, historically Celtic lands. Some others would say, but they were actually Lyrian. Maybe at this point there were also islands of Germans. Absolutely. There was also the Romanization stratum, the colonies, etc. But at large, aside from the Lyrians that were a bit in the south, these areas historically were heavily Celticized. So they were basically Celto-Roman, if we really want to look at that. The Pannonian Celts are very underrated. It took tens of imperial legions to subdue them. But at this point, they also produced Martin of Tours, who emerged from a Roman military family, as we were looking at that point, so from a few generations after Diocletian's rule, that had established a veritable inheritance of the father's profession, of the family's crafts in this sense. His life thus already set on that military track. And this is very interesting as a starter to begin with. And that was defined, at least according to a geography, by the tension between his father's martial expectations and his own spiritual calling. Now, first and foremost, there are some obvious embellishments and adaptations in the hagiographic version of our reality that is not less relevant, however, from a religious, a Christian point of view. Right? We understand, and this is just a gut feeling, having read the work, a very specifically wanted adaptation of all that set of beliefs that a Roman equus could have, even just from his sociocultural background in a military family, concerning, in fact, the attitude toward the same army, the exercise of violence, and so on. It's also not implausible, by the way, that some members of these families at some point really, this is actually documented in many other instances, not including the ones of the military saints, but not only, right, and also for different reasons, but always tendentially, if not embellished, properly modified to fit a more sort of absolute Christian narrative that was, in fact, in some elements of the church unnerved by the notion that, in fact, a lay authority could achieve divinity through the exercise, not much through the exercise of attaining divinity to begin with. The entire deal of why Christianity had affirmed was the, after all, pretty self-evident decline at some point in history of imperial authority, and so the actual achievements of the individual rulers that historically, also by tradition, were considered like the sole responsibles for the success or failure of their people. They were the divine media, and so when you look at the equus, also the medieval knight in general later, there is always this ambition. This lives very much in the theology of the soul of chivalry in Ghibelline tradition, but it was just inherent in a more universal sense that what would become second estate, at least the military was originally leaders and commanders, the first estate, but, this was exactly a time in which the odds were relatively balanced. So you can understand why Sulpicius Severus and the general tradition about St. Martin may have specifically highlighted this aspect. In fact, it was incredibly important for Martin to have been from this background, which we can assume, by the way, was true. I mean, for those who had known him, by the way, the geography is contemporary, as we understand, so it's very contextual, it's very plausible. And in general, people can always doubt whatever they want, but the entire picture makes sense, even in the smoothening, the neatening of the narrative. Martin's father, a tribune who had risen from a common soldier to a senior officer in the Roman army, and the ambition of whom you can definitely understand in that sense, secured veteran land in Ticinum, that is Pavia, in northern Italy, the future capital of the Lombard Kingdom, where Martin was raised. Interestingly enough, born in Pannonia, raised in Italy, and as we will see now, making quite a career in Gaul. The household adhered to the traditional Roman pantheon, so to say, venerating, of course, in all the hierarchical and hypostatic concept of that, Jupiter, Juno, Mars, whose cults were entrenched among the military elite in particular. Christianity was also already a thing. It's not like you came from a military family, you despise Christianity per se. As we know also from today's ideological mixes across social strata and general, provenances from the world, things can be quite complex. But we also know that Mithraism, for example, a mystery religion, essentially stemming from one of the Dioscoroi of the Vedic and later Iranian, passing probably to the West pantheon, so to say, that the Romans had, by the way, on their own, because the myth, for example, of the Sol Invictus was present in archaic Sabine, for example, way before Mithraism was sort of until you understand that, again, the Dioscoroi tradition was alive among all the Indo-Europeans from the beginning, emphasizing, in any case, at that point in history, 3rd, 4th century, loyalty and discipline, being often described as a essentially military tradition, because it stemmed from, in fact, some of also the most warlike feudal knightly cultures. Think about Persia in general, and so it was really loaded with this also relatively earthly references, if anything, because as you know, Mithras passes from a stone to the sun as a being, and so it is the prototype of the winner of the absolute hero to begin with, and so you must pass through the earth if you want to achieve heaven to begin with. And this religion had been particularly prevalent in the army. Its subterranean sanctuaries dotting the empire's frontiers. We know it pretty well. And at this point still, Christianity, though legalized by the Edict of Milan in 313, remained, at least in some of these milieu, minority faith, and especially among soldiers who viewed it with suspicion due to its, at least to some extreme extent, pacifist undertones. Christianity is actually not a pacifistic ideology, it's actually quite overtly warlike, except, again, the way, unfortunately, religion in general diluted its primal meaning, and we'll understand better how with St. Martin, at least as he actually was the opposite of this, also in the actual achievements after he abandoned the army, and so the seculum per se. And urban concentration as well, that especially in the frontier of the empire, that was more militarized, but non-historically was very scarcely sort of developed province compared to, say, Italy, for example, but at this point even Pavia, Milan, etc., as you know, were some of the most strategically relevant areas. We talked about the fortifications of, for example, of the Gallo-Romans, of the Longobards throughout from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages, in fact in Gaul, in Italy, and therefore, just by clientele, by broader connections in the army, if you belong to this kind of families, you were pretty sort of fluidly aware of the entire strategic landscape that these very lands represented. And you were already, just by ethos, initiated, just by being born in those families, to that kind of military religious horizon. So the story goes that Martin, this is the hagiography, right? It is the only source, all right? At the age of 10, was drawn to Christianity, right? Defying his parents' disapproval to become a catechumen. Again, for this, hagiography is full of this, but in certain cases you can at least imagine it to be plausible from certain particular social background, etc. Here it's not like it can't have happened, but it sounds so specifically crafted as a narrative by the author to stress the fact that Martin belonged somehow at all points in his history to Christianity, and so even as a kid he wanted to be a Christian, and as a bottom line of the hagiographic work, like he just happened to be a soldier, but he wasn't that convinced, seems too pushed. All right, seems too much too fabricated. Like if you don't become, to begin with, you don't become an eques cataphractarius in the Schole Palatine of the emperor, like in major campaigns like the ones against the Alammani in Gaul, if you're not the single most violently professional military elite ever existed ever, right? This is something that we have seen also in other videos, like the one about the Protectores, for example. They were very close, by the way, to figures like these, were extracted from this kind of picked crack units. Martin, according to hagiography, attended Christian assemblies in secret, which at that point was also, why should I have it done? Like, if he was so proud of that, unless we're talking the one he was too young, like, could be a thing. In any case, the bottom line is that he absorbed the teachings of Christ in a world where the, a tradition, still a pretty sound, also urban, pre-Christian tradition existed in the elite, in the establishment, and so on. You have really just made a video about Theodosius to wait for the end of the 4th century to have properly a crackdown on the pre-Christian cults. The military elite was at this point free to be non-Christian without any problem, and not being accused or, sort of penalized for this. Even though, again, the sense that the imperial authority was leaning towards at least the cooptation of many Christian elements, would makes it absolutely obvious, by the way, to have so many Christian soldiers already in the army. As we know, it was the case from centuries. All right, we have plenty of evidence of this. I made multiple videos on the Christian apologists of the first centuries that, again, were explicitly supporting the Roman victory in arms for the sake of Christian protection within the empire. There's the famous miracle of the rain at the time of the Marcomannic Wars, right? The Christians said, it was Christ that saved those Roman legions in Bohemia from dying of thirst out there. Of course, the imperial authority at the time said, well, what do these Christians even want to say about that? But that simply means how many Christian soldiers already existed there, and how it was absolutely normal for a Christian to be a soldier, as it will be later. So also the entire idea that Christianity would have sort of diluted the value of soldiers, whatever, that the Christian societies were less military powerful, whatever, it's a whole pile of BS that you can debunk by infinite macroscopical evidence throughout all the millennia that followed. Besides, someone like Martin would have absolutely despised lesser people's pagensis kind of superstitious, chthonic, telluric, Dionysian beliefs, as the peasantry largely also insisted in, since even the Bronze Age or pre even the Indo-European invasion, because throughout all this time, who had ruled at the top believed in the Catholic dimension, in the Apollonian, the Uranian world domination, sort of transcendence, and in fact rise to divinity. lesser people in the inferior strata of the population were, as you know, as materialistic as, even though not much as we are today, but completely aware of the fact that they were the counter element and that they didn't really count much. In fact, Christianity didn't really care very much about what people kept believing in the countryside, not only because nobody had the capacity to enforce any kind of single thought, or not even today we can, or ideological belief with the coercive means of the time, but simply because these people didn't pose any threat whatsoever, nor from a religious, nor from a political point of view, zero. They were subjects, they worked, and so they could still believe whatever they wanted, and they also Christianized themselves, blending also some pre-Christian beliefs that were, however, largely tolerated, also because they were, in a broader sense, as they supported especially the authority, fully within the wake of the Indo-European Catholic tradition of the previous millennia. So they were completely in line with the idea of an empire, an authority, the sacrality of the empire, of the auctoritas, specifically was the hallmark of Romanity, in the sense at this point of divinity, that was fully sort of overlapping with the Christian one in the holy urbs of Rome, and that, as we've seen also in the video about Montjoie Saint-Denis, basically would simply switch the literary name Mons Jovis to Montjoie, which literally means the Mount of Jupiter to Mount of Joy, as basically the entire Western Europe, and surely also beyond, was dotted with mountains, hills, with castles, citadels, altars dedicated to Jupiter, and everything simply continued in the same identical way. Right there, you have churches later, and the same sacrality, if anything, being forgotten later, as the entire sort of world degenerated, not because Christianity simply superimposed itself with that. I mean, still, churches preserve historically many hypogean buildings that were literally like the vestiges of the former temples underneath the same churches. This is open en plein air everywhere in Europe. Like, if you are not even aware of this, it means it immediately says that you haven't traveled at all whatsoever. In any case, and so just to say that there is no mystery about this. The idea that there is this enormous conspiracy theory that wanted to distract you from the older tradition is exactly the same product of lesser people's superstitious, materialistic obscurantism that characterized the fortes, the masses of the population since ever, right? Since they were conquered and lorded over, or even before that, the civilization of the matter, by the great Apollonian rulers of divine descent. But, where to find content on this topic. Now, continuing with the geography, by 12, and so that's why he was basically hiding, because Christian belief, Martin aspired to the ascetic life of hermit, envisioning a solitary existence dedicated to prayer and contemplation, which naturally would have constituted, if followed at that point, a radical departure from the martial path his father envisioned. This all within a Christian lens. One could say that initiation, the sense of ascetic experiences, they were just very common at the time to begin with. They had already existed. We know that, again, the old tradition did the same exact thing. Ascetic experiences, for example, were searched by Scipio before his final showdown in Africa in the temple on Capitol Hill of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. We know of course, very specific initiatic rules, and think about the comitatus, the war beds, how they were literally expelled from the Zippe, from sort of, we could say, civil society, even though the distinction wasn't essentially fully categorically enucleated at the time, to achieve that kind of spiritual capacity that would allow them to do what they did as soldiers at that point. So there's no doubt that Christianity intended something, actually in the ultimate Christomimesis, the purpose was always world's domination. All right, achieving heaven is not merely an individual matter, it's some collective matter. Monasticism was never secluded from reality. It was actually, especially in some areas like Gaul, as we've seen here, Martin is not there yet, but think about the Laurent. Some of the most prestigious ecclesiastical careers, such as the one in Arles, as Bishop of Arles. Arles was essentially the prefecture of the Gaul after it would be at least later shifted from Trier because it was too close to the Rhine frontier during the breakthrough of the early 15th century, were recently staffed by people who practice Hermitage in the Lorraine island in front of Cap d'Antibes, where Napoleon later landed to start his 100 days. The bottom line being that ascetic or hermitic lifestyle was not unique to the Christian experience. It could mean different things because at the end of the day, it's a very, in a sense, really free vocational experience. What happens in this world, also through the later monastic orders that differentiated even different experiences, privileged certain parts of St. Benedict's rule as opposed to other and so on, was already a thing in the past. Christianity, in part, surely hid this at some point because the bottom line, as it happens in this hagiography, is that only Christianity matters at that point. But we do know very well through Mithraism itself that such sort of specific paths, spiritual paths, were highly connected, especially with the knightly business that we're looking at here. I will not repeat according to the geography unless it's necessary because that's where we get the information anyway. At 15, Martin's trajectory was abruptly altered by an imperial edict likely issued under Constantine II or Constans, mandating military service for the sons of veterans, which actually was already a thing, but these edicts were also una tantum things. You couldn't apply this uniformly all across the empire. It was mostly connected with local governors' will, right? The local governor's will and capacity. In any case, this is how the hagiography tells you, again, that he really didn't care about military, right? He was just a Christian, and such Christians think, as we'll see, at another order of level, so to say, and Martin was basically compelled to military service, because otherwise he would have not gone out there and wanted that. The greatest likelihood is that Martin actually joined at that point, at that age, as a hyper-bloodthirsty individual who was searching all the glory and power, and truly also because of a veritable spiritual and intense religious belief that may have even overlapped with Christianity already, as far as we're concerned, as many other soldiers, as we've seen, did and true, completely faithful Christians did in the previous centuries. But here there is the drama, because naturally his father, frustrated by Martin's piety and perhaps fearing the loss of social status tied to military service, handed him over to the authorities. This is badass and pretty cool also in the story to insert, because it's also very spot on. And it definitely echoes those times' sociocultural understanding, because you were not just like a mere subject that had to perform military service. These people were rich, all right? They were powerful, and they had their own clienteles, and they had to continue their business. If your son did not do the same, the system was, your family was done for in a broader sense. A bit like, think about St. Francis, that was a knight himself. His father was a rich merchant, right? And there was this enormous expectation for him to continue on that path, right? By the way, St. Francis, I made a video about him once. We'll come back on him. He eventually went over to the crusade, and he started criticizing crusaders, not, the hagiography says, because, they were fighting or shedding blood, but how they did that. which apparently was not effective enough crusade-wise. Just to tell you how absolutely militarized, in fact, military saints' personal background would actually remain, properly within also St. Paul's vocabulary of militia Christi, and as you know, all what was created specifically to convert the Romans as a warlike people to the Christian faith. I mean, St. Mark's Gospel is designed for the Romans, and in fact has very specific issues there, dealing probably with what the Romans, from the cut that the Romans were more interested in. So there is perhaps too much drama. The fact that the father would hand Martin over to the authorities just because he was a Christian and did not want essentially to join the army seems, again, a bit too forced. However, it's possible that at some point during this era, some situation of this kind would have occurred. Like, you don't want to join the army, you're the son of an officer, you have to go there. Like, why wouldn't you do it? There would have been some kind of pressure, torture of some kind. In fact, according to a geography, bound in chains to ensure compliance, Martin was compelled to swear the military oath, which also does not really render a great service to. I mean, yeah, Christ is renegated by Peter multiple times in the most hopeless, in fact, of circumstances. So here the rhetorical experience is mostly, okay, well, we have to explain how he entered the army. So he was forced to swear the military oath, which, by the way, would be very interesting to study in its development throughout Roman history, because, say, by the time of Constantine, what did it really mean to legalize, for example, Christian cult, and how did this go along with the army, where lots of Christians already were, for example, compared to the previous times? Because the entire problem, as we said before, of the military saints were at large that they were put down because they refused, as most Christians did, but in particular in the army, because that was something way more cultically and camaraderie compelling, to recognize the emperor as a divinity. And things changed a little bit, both in the military practice and probably in the vision of the sovereign. Not much, because actually, as you know, the Roman emperors at this point hadn't increased their own sebastocratic appearance and had become much more authoritarian than before. But because, in fact, Christians were needed, and this forcing of, let's say, probably of a stubborn, like, okay, if you don't recognize the emperor per se, was probably nobody's convenience. And first of all, in fact, the soldiers, and which is also the reason why you could be a Christian and do that anyway. There is an entire, as you know, ecclesiastical, historical, monumental amount of evidence regarding the fact that bishops at some point said, okay, well, if you really had to get yourself killed in the process, just sacrifice to the emperor, and then you will pay for it later, but it's not a huge deal, right? You have to be pragmatic, but you have to be intelligent. Christians were not just sort of a bunch of fanatics, or whether it's not like, by the way, that level of religious belief or fundamentalism even wasn't shared by other groups at the time at all. Right? It was an incredibly violent world, and violence was pretty evenly shared, as a matter of fact. So swearing the military oath was an enormous deal, because it was not just a solemn act binding Martin, as any other soldier, to the emperor's service, which was a very and deeply, again, clienterly, also even personal thing, because, again, he was in the Schole Palatine of the emperor, right? So this guy was really presented at the highest levels of the military cadres to the emperor himself, right? He knew him. He talked to him at some point. In any case, he was always with him as a unit, and a picked unit, one that required an enormous dedication. Like, if you're not mentally strong, as you very well know from military training, you can immediately understand if you're not good at it, right? It's just a psycho-aptitude. You can change that, you can train yourself, but if we're talking about the Schole Palatine in late Roman Empire, I never made a video about the Schole Palatine, but if you have an idea of what they were, again, if you're not just personally predisposed to slaughter hundreds of people, you can't be into that, all right? You don't work, right? And so that's why here the geographic claim is understandable, and also nice to read if you read Sulpicius Severus, but difficultly believable. If not in a broader spiritual question, because, again, the times were in fact the ones of the rise of Christianity. Many people did really have this kind of moral issues, this conscience problems. We'll explain now what this meant for someone who had sought military service, and so binding himself to sin, I was finished to say, not just with the emperor, but with the idea that you were there to achieve imperial, universal domination, and that divine transfiguration would come out of it. This was the only belief that existed at the time. That was shared also by the Christians, that at least understood that this could be accomplished only through Christ. That was the actually only difference. Then the Christians who wrote for telling us these stories were naturally not soldiers. And so they tell stories also later that we know did not align in general with, for example, the military ethos. So it's not even like Christianity at large was like that, as these Christian soldiers very well prove. It's just a literary distortion that you must be able to understand, not even a theological one, as a matter of fact, because we know also relatively few about, say, the early 4th century actual sort of religious predisposition and belief and attitude toward the world and so on. We can't sort of understand it through other indicators, but the social cultural background is drying up a little bit towards this Byzantine crystallization of the world, where you don't have the sort of florid Christian apologetic, at least from some random guy who sort of integrated in the world, living it in the previous eras. You have mostly either courtier or ecclesiastics that within the church, and that's it. And what is in between, you often don't see, including this elite military. It's from Sulpicius Severus that we know, quite importantly for the narrative, that Martin was assigned to the Equites Cataphractari Ambianenses, a heavy cavalry unit of approximately 500 troops, but we are sure actually, part of the Scole Palatine, elite Imperial Guard regiments established by Constantine the Great after disbanding the Praetorian Guard in 312. Something similar already existed from before, and again, it's the Scole Palatine, yes, but it's also the Equites Cataphractari, that is to say, the heaviest Roman unit existing at the time. The knights, right? The shock, brutal, we will make a video about, I already made actually one in the very early days of Schwerpunkt, but we will make more about the Roman Equites Cataphractaris, even just psychophysical training, right? You have to be a hell of a human specimen to be part of that, even just in a quite explicit athletic sense, and especially with enormously cold nerves. Because, again, you cannot chop hundreds of people to pieces on a regular basis if you are not exclusively designed as a being for that. And military initiation ensured, through incredibly persuasive means, trauma. You were basically destroyed as a human being and recreated as a man. And you don't want to know how that happened, by the way. To be in particular of this kind of elite, ultra-elite heavy cavalry. The Scole, each led by a tribune ranked as a comes, a count of the first class, served as the emperor's personal bodyguard. That suffices to say. This was a mobile force accompanying the emperor across the empire, stationed primarily at Samarobriva, Amiens, France, with possible postings in Milan, Trier, and other imperial centers. By the way, these were among these, Milan and Trier were by far the most important strategic centers of the West at the time. The unit was composed of both native Romans and recruits from Germanic tribes like the Franks and Alammani, reflecting the empire's increasing reliance on barbarian auxiliaries. I have a video on early Frankish warfare that will really open your mind regarding about probably the amount of these elements. Again, Martin was Celto-Roman, essentially. However, when you see the Battle of Argentorat of Strasbourg, you realize that the Auxilia Palatina that saved the day on the Roman right flank were Celto-Germanic in nature, and they allowed to destroy. In fact, the Alemannic left in that circumstances. I also recently made a video about Alemannic warfare that talks about a bit, the Alammani from the side of the Romans as well. Not as much as the Franks will, but they were basically there. The cataphractari were heavily armored, clad in scale mail and wielding lances, their white woolen cloaks known as chlamyde, symbolizing their elite status. That's a very interesting alignment with purity, with heaven, with, again, whiteness. We talked about this in sort of very archetypally explicit terms when looking at a Roman tradition and beyond, besides what we just said about the presence of Germanic troops. And I said also Celtic because literally there were people as far as Ireland that brought a bit their Gaelic Fiannes vibe to that. Is exactly this, that you have to understand that such barbarian, at this point yet Romanized element within the Imperial army was absolutely bringing, as much as the cataphract model, so the Sarmatian knight would have incarnated, and that the Romans inspired themselves from, that all that said, not much zootechnical capacities, have, opological expertise and so on, but more importantly, the spiritual attitude that someone fighting as a cataphract must have. Thus, Martin was not alien, for sure, to the most advanced war band, and at this point actually knightly, very oligarchic and elite, initiatory and training practices that this kind of elite forces and warriors, even up, from the steppe up to the Volga with the Alans and so on, really were preserving and pioneering at the time. Martin was a circitor, according to the story, held a junior supervisory role, conducting night patrols, inspecting sentries, and overseeing camp discipline. This was actually a very high and elevated one, which underscores the guy's expertise, because in order to achieve that, you really had to be an incredibly responsible, charismatic, attentive, cold-blooded individual. I made some videos about this kind of issues, discipline, camp life, passwords, kind of sentries, like message communication in the Roman army. Not much for the later Roman Empire, but also. So if you're interested, you can check that out in my Roman camp playlist. This position earned Martin a double sword, a modest stipend, well, not really necessarily, but it was supplemented in any case, more importantly, by imperial donatives, because it's not like the Roman army was ever fully salaried all the time, every year in the same way, just for sure, right? It was all depending on the ups and downs of the world in those tormented eras. Martin also had an attendant whom, according to the hagiography, he treated with unprecedented equality, or at least modesty, allegedly cleaning his boots and sharing meals in a manner that stunned his comrades. So here you understand that the hagiography exaggerates a little bit. It's perfectly plausible that was some level of companionship, brotherhood, and all this stuff, and that it's very well possible that Martin maybe was a more spiritually inclined individual who was really reflecting deeply on the broader meaning of being a soldier and what it meant to be part of the army as a sacred band, so to say, in this imperial order with that very loaded Catholic function, both militarily and religiously. The fact that here he was treating this attendant as a peer is shocking for his comrades, because of course these would have been very high status individuals as Martin, and so they didn't understand how a lower, like basically a squire or something, would be treated as a peer. And this could simply be Sulpicius Severus's narrative. Martin's military service, spanning roughly 25 years, began under Constantine II, reigning between 337 and 340, and continued through the reigns of Constantius II, and Julian, the latter reigning 361-363. A bit too long, I would say, not just for not having ever spilled somebody's blood and not being a ferocious slaughterer in that nightmarish meat grinder that late antique warfare really was, but also just speaking of, and these reigns witness a lot of warfare in general. We've seen also some recent videos about other, in fact, 4th century emperors that fought constantly on the Rhine frontier, and so if you were stationed again there in Trier or even in northern Italy, and you were there basically, there were incursions all around. He had been very active, and therefore even the fact that he survived 25 years in service speaks volumes about the amount of blood that this guy spilled. The Roman army of the 4th century, we talked about, if anything, the broader later Roman army. We never, I think, made a video about the 4th century one specifically, but it was one of the most effective Roman armies ever, arguably the most tactically proficient and at least combined arms based in Roman history. It was a professional force. Its legions and auxilia organized into comitatenses, field armies, and limitanae, border troops, with the Scholae Palatinae representing the pinnacle of prestige, because they were basically always in the field, right? They followed the emperor everywhere. They were immediately ready. They followed him essentially as a retinue, as a broader personal army. And as such, they shared basically the single most important political and strategical vicissitudes with the emperor. They were the enforcers of the same. Martin's unit, likely, as we've seen, numbering 500, 600 men, was trained for rapid deployment, escorting the emperor or engaging in campaigns against barbarian incursions along the Rhine and Danube. I would like to stress, by the way, that Martin came from a place that was basically akin, in ethnocultural terms, to the so-called Illyrian emperors of the essentially the Diocletian and Constantinian era that technically was still going on, meaning actually Celto-Romans. Again, Illyria is eventually the name that the overall province takes, or the Illyricum in a broader sense, but those places specifically were the ones once occupied by the Scordisci. Here in Pannonia, some other groups, also the Scordisci, but a mix in general. Not just these people were very motivated, as we've seen in military career, and they were very heavily indoctrinated in the utmost fidelity to Rome in absolute terms, but they were, see, Sean Battley, if you look at the geography of this, they were very close exactly to those areas on the Danube. They were not just very tormented from a military point of view, but were quite familiar with peoples like the Jazyges, for example, the Sarmatians at large. And so even this equus cataphractarius' role that Martin had was probably not peregrine in general. But years ago, in modern-day Croatia, we found, archaeologically speaking, the burial, essentially, of a local Illyro-Roman or whatever aristocrat. We're talking senatorial level, and I think this was from the 2nd century AD, or even still probably with an actual war chariot into that. Right, you know that the Romans didn't really they had chariots, and they actually overly represented themselves with the older symbolism of the Bronze Age hero ascending to heaven on the chariot. But literally, and they didn't use this at war actually anymore, if not with the Cairo ballista or something like that. So not in the older function, but the fact that these guys still represented themselves, not far away from where Martin had been born, with that mentality, I think speaks volumes about the general background of these people. how familiar they were with the most advanced military religious practices of the era, and rising with them essentially incorporated. Right? The military life was harsh, to say the least, marked by long marches, typically fortified camps, and the constant threat of ambush in Gaul's volatile frontier. We've seen with the Alammani how many ambushes, even just randomly, the emperors moving from a city to another could fall into if there was some random Alammanic war band passing by. Soldiers were expected to uphold Roman disciplina, a code of loyalty and obedience, yet many indulged in the vices of camp life, as always, like gambling, drinking, and exploitation of local populations as well. This was oddly typical, especially of the province. These guys, intercepted the aforementioned Alammanic war bands loaded with loot of some place in Gaul, and after having destroyed them, especially if you were part of the Schola Palatina, you would have eaten such intrusive parties for breakfast, really. You would have kept, however, the wealth, right? There was surely a level of, as you know, socio-cultural disease in general in late antiquity, not just because of these invasions, but because the whole world was, if not on fire, in ashes or something like that. And in general, the religious, the spiritual torment that we see here with the rise of Christianity, the tension with the older order, and the fact that this had been collapsing and that a new sort of spiritual standard had to be representated, arose, especially among this elite that was more directly called into question. Because the ultimate point, we'll see it better, is how far can you go and how far can you achieve? Martin, in this sense, stood apart as also one of the greatest saints in the history of Europe. His kindness, humility, and austerity at the same time earned him the reputation of a monk rather than a soldier. There was something romantically chivalric about this idea of selflessness that is in part, in fact, inherited by later chivalry. Surely was present in some nobiliar fashion and not quite in the humbling, quite almost, in fact, humiliating and meek way suggested by Sulpicius Severus. Again, there is no doubt, given this guy's record, curriculum, chevrons, so to say, this was one of the greatest slaughtering machines of his era, just like all his comrades in the Schola Palatina were. The length of the service, the position as a hyper-specialized, ultra-elite knight, it leaves, for the times and places, no doubt whatsoever about whom this man was, regardless of what the geography says. The source says that Martin gave generously to the needy, often leaving himself with little beyond his weapons and cloak, and we know very well what St. Martin's iconography in our Christianity is. His comrades, accustomed to the rough camaraderie of the barracks, marveled at his temperance, noting that he seemed to embody Christian virtues, in fact, in a quite differently dominated world. The defining moment of Martin's military career occurred in the winter of 334 at the gates of Amiens. We are in today's northeastern France, important frontier area at the time. Encountering a beggar shivering in the cold, most famously, Martin, having already distributed his possessions, drew his sword and divided his climate, that was again a symbol of actual divine power, giving half to the destitute men. The profound implications of this are better left to another video about Christian theology. But you can understand how the contempt towards the mere material possession was seen as an act of pure spiritual force. It was winter, by the way. A knight needed his cloak. It wasn't just a quite expensive one. He could get another one, granted. But in general, the act was extraordinary. Not only for its charity, but for its symbolism. The cloak, a mark of imperial service, was a valuable asset, its woolen fabric providing warmth in Gaul's harsh winters, and more importantly, in this sense, showing that Martin believed that all these things were earthly, unimportant. And that thus he looked up to the perennial nature, the divine one, as opposed to the fallen one of this world. It's the idea that you are transcending the saeculum and you are achieving divinity. In fact, that night, Martin experienced a vision in which Christ appeared, which is technical martyrdom in the sense that we think that martyrdom is just being killed. All right? No, martyr in Greek means literally witness meant to God, right? Properly had this appearance of Christ, and that is a glimpse properly in the perennial nature. It means that the guy is himself transfiguring by some degree. And in this vision, Christ himself, clad in the gifted cloak of the calamity, proclaimed to a host of angels, quote, "Martin, who is still but a catechumen, clothed me with this robe." This is beautiful, inspiringly enough, from a Catholic standpoint, right? The fact that there is something primogenially here, virginal about it, intended properly in a military sense, in Mars terms. The march after Mars is probably the moment of the rebooting of the army activities, the symbol of the Aries, of the eternal spring, Apollo, Kyrios, just like Christ, that carries, of course, as the good shepherd, the same Aries, ushering in on his shoulders, ushering in this new moment, this new age, right, of mankind, intended, as we explained recently in the video about the Roman, Indo-European meaning of heaven, was properly visualized. The wool, even, properly was the same symbol, as you've seen, like the Virgilian sort of purpureal and golden wool of the sheep, of the meek that is transfigured in the golden age as well, that acquires the same color of gold like the gods. Remember this when you criticize the Christianization, because what actually Christianity says is identical to what appears in Virgil, which it's also not surprising considering that the Christians literally took what Virgil said and said, this, he's talking about Christ, he's talking about the new Apollo, the new Phoebus, the new progeny is actually the new child of man, right? Now, this divine encounter, this vision, recorded, of course, by Sulpicius Severus in the Vita Sancti Martini, then there are also the deeds, but in the same work, confirmed Martin's faith and marked a turning point. At 18, because here it's also the list of all the things, of the miracles, right, that Martin did. At 18, during Easter in Amiens, Martin had been baptized, formally embracing Christianity in a ceremony that likely involved immersion and the Eucharist, aligning with the practices of the early church. Given that he was baptized that young, and at this point consciously, by the way, willingly, and that he spent 25 years in the army, so as we've seen here, joined at 15, so other 22 years in arms as a Christian, well, that's not really much the indicator, again, in this times and places, considering what these people were called to do there, this great sense that his military activity was unimportant. As we've seen, he even had a prestigiously important and disciplinarianly charismatic function in the army. In fact, in the hagiography, his baptism is understood as just the strain of things that should basically represent Martin as still relatively distant spiritually from military obligations. We forget here, at least the author forgets, that of course the military obligations probably were one for Martin like that. He had a religion, even if we may even imagine at this point he was not a Christian, or maybe he still despised Christianity, maybe he actually converted later, in fact, after all those years of services, as opposed to what here Sulpicius Severus says. It is still all one with the broader Catholic issue of the era. Roman law, by the way, required soldiers to complete their terms unless released by imperial decree or exceptional circumstances. Definitely Martin will abandon his military life, at least in an earthly sense, but eventually stayed very long in the army, well, aware, and again, they were not bound literally like this way. If you were, yes, there was a discipline also in that sense, but the way you would be discharged could be dishonorable, and at that point it would have been an enormous loss anyway for you, especially from that milieu that we described before. So Martin did not do it, so he was very well convinced as a soldier, and possibly even as a Christian soldier already. The story, by the way, says that he basically stayed only 2 years in the army before something changed. But again, if you take into account the date, etc., the dating of Sulpicius is seemingly inconsistent, right? Things, he was born, say, because if you account it was born in 336, you would think that he was that young when he abandoned the army, but there is the possibility was actually older, and so that this whole story was again fabricated as well. And normally, again, you joined with that training with an enormous fitness that was, in any case, motivated by an intense devotion to military life. So the story is that after his baptism, he stayed for 2 years in the army. So that would be actually more, even than 2 years. And he was persuaded by his tribune, a tent mate who shared his tent and meals, promising to retire to religious life after his service. And this period was one of internal conflict for Martin, who saw himself as a soldier of Christ rather than Caesar. But what did that mean? If you believe that Christ, by definition, is the Lord, and you have to imitate him as a Christian, what does that actually mean? Also, according to Christianity, in fact, Christ achieved divinity, immortality, and as such, he transfigured the world. And so if you get into it, and if you realize the contrast between that witness and the emperor of the era that definitely did not seem to have achieved immortality, the idea is that in a Christian sense, in fact, Christ is God himself, and so whichever other earthly authority cannot compare by definition, including yourself, which has nothing to do with unrecognizing that authority. You may not recognize it as fully divine because we're all still sort of mortal and there, and so what does this person do? It's possible that later this person earns a place in the firmament, whatever, but is it God, really? And especially, what about you? Why do you have to simply see yourself as a subject in that sense? If you recognize the greatness of a leader, yes, and you decide to follow him to improve yourself, yes. But if you think that there is something more and you can achieve it, which is in this sense the plot twist, and so the fact that you have to struggle, you will not be merely saved by someone else. All right, works do matter, and you have a responsibility in front of Christ, who especially prescribe you that kind of memento, rather than simply saying, do this just because I do it, which is always sort of metaphorical and transcendental in meaning at the end of the day. In any case, Martin's duties as a church tutor continued. His heart was fixed on spiritual matters, and he avoided the moral pitfalls of military life. Which means, in practice, that even after this moment of sort of crisis, due to the confidence, by the way, of another Christian, as a matter of fact, in the same army, in the same, as we've seen, the same tent that was shared by his comrades, that he continued to be a soldier, right? And so that his change of soul did not actually bring him to actually leave the army in the moment, but still to avoid some of the lowest part of the saying, what seemed to be, in fact, also the dysfunctional aspect. It's well possible that maybe this guy had enormous expectations and that these were not met in the military, because he literally thought not that military life was wrong, but that human military life was wrong. In 354, during a campaign against the Alammani at Civitas Vangionum, that would be today's Worms in Germany, we're in the Rhineland, Martin faced his final military test. The Alammani, a confederation of Germanic tribes, had been raiding Roman territories along the Rhine, as we were pointing out before, prompting a response from Julian, then Caesar in Gaul. Julian was a Caesar from 355 to 360. You know, that meant at the time being essentially the heir of the emperors, of the would-be emperor. Julian distributed a donative monetary bonus to bolster troop morale at Borbeto Magus, Martin stepped forward and declared, in front of the emperor by the way, "Hitherto I have served you as a soldier. Allow me now to become a soldier to God. Let the man who is to serve thee receive thy donative. I am the soldier of Christ, and it is not lawful for me to fight." Right? And so here the hagiography literally says, okay, so you were a Christian up to that point, and here in the hagiography, of course, there was no mention of battles or whatever, but as we've seen for years, it was in the army, and lots of these issues arose, and so it's absolutely implausible that he had a problem with fighting as such. What this actually means is, as basically all the other military saints are aware of, is that they couldn't serve the emperor. This is very explicit here. It says, "I'm not your soldier. I'm a soldier of God. And as such, I can't basically receive anything from you. I literally, return to Caesar what is of Caesar." Why? Because by doing so, you renounce basically the saculum entirely. Because Caesar, in this case, that is, of course, provided with an imperium, and so it's always an Augustan power, is actually supposed to be the one who ruled the world. Also, Julian was known later for being specifically, the one who failed as an emperor, at least lasted too few, and mostly because, in sort of a broader providential sense, was adverse to Christians. So this is really, in the hagiographic narrative, not random, right? Julian would have been seen as a symbol of anti-Christian personality disorder, or kind of, I don't know why he came up with that, but it's somehow funny considering today's pathologization of everything. Of course, there were much deeper beliefs, but Julian definitely had tried to restore the traditional Roman religion, which meant that he wanted essentially to restore the possibility of the emperor to save the world as such, which is a bit the tension between the papacy and the empire later on. It's not like these powers do not mutually support one another. Christians supported the empire also when Julian was emperor, and Romanity as well. And Julian passes as a great defeat of history because he basically is outraged by, again, one of those people who triggered him to begin with. In fact, according to the story, at least, he was enraged, accusing Martin of cowardice and alleging fear of the impending battle, because these donatives were being distributed in the face of the clash against the Alammani. And so here there is also the episode that shows how, from the same Christian hagiography, Martin actually wanted to confront the enemy without arms for a specific reason, not trying to put, flowers into this guy's Spangenhelm, but because he was overly confident, and rightfully so, according to, of course, the hagiography and the Christian belief about the saint, that he could defeat the Alammani with the sheer force of the spirit, which is the actual meaning that people don't contemplate as the correct one regarding the concept of Christian sanctity. It's not about being sheep and being butchered. It is about showing what kind of power, what kind of miracles can happen when you manifest that level of divinity, of supernatural power, when you actually defy death herself, which was literally what also the old Roman religion fully believed. And so, in fact, if you read the hagiographies, it's basically a clash of miracle versus miracle. There were some province of the pre-Christian culture that was scary and that surely coming from God by a degree, but only to be essentially surpassed by the spiritual purity and, in this sense, magnitudinal superiority of Christian asceticism and a deeper belief in Christ's actual accomplishment of victory over death as the only Lord would have, at least in this time of mankind, probably also announced the meaning of his manifestation. In fact, in this case, Martin, undaunted, offered to stand unarmed before the enemy. He didn't want to abandon the army. He actually wanted to defeat the Alammani, that were the enemy also for him, protected solely by the sign of the cross. He said, in front of this, I will show you, through my own faith, there's something very auspicious about this in the sense that it's not merely the cross as a symbol that simply can stop the enemy. It is how the saint, and so the sacred ruler, actually in the older tradition, could vehiculate through the rite this power, right? In this case, through the cross as through Christ, because he was the guy who had already accomplished that. It's a bit like how Augustus, managed to rule an empire because of Caesar's mediation and divinization, for that matter. Imprisoned for his defiance, however, Martin prepared to face the Alammani weaponless, nevertheless, because they would let him do that. A bold act of faith that challenged Roman military culture, at least in the human standard that was habituated to use weapons to defeat the enemy, and to take the war just out of mere providence, which, as you know, also in Latin means literally the capacity to foresee the future, because it's a bit like the eye of Ra. Everything is molded by your own will, just by wanting it. This is a divine prerogative. The next day, however, the Alammani sought peace, surrendering without combat. Sulpicius Severus attributes this to divine intervention, a bloodless victory that freed Martin from military service in 356, allowing him to pursue his spiritual vocation. And so here, actually, the hagiography, you can say, really begins, but let's say the saint's passage had already occurred, like the first miracle, the Alammanic surrender, basically, to the Romans because of Martin's intercession. Upon leaving the army, Martin sought Hilary of Poitiers, a Trinitarian bishop exiled to Phrygia for opposing Arianism, a heresy that denied Christ's full divinity, by the way, and that, remember, was very actually common among the barbarians. And so those who allegedly claimed that God had actually done all what Christ could have not done alone, because he would have not had himself divinity, which theologically speaking sounds very much like some sort of Protestantism, because if, in this sense, the Son does not quite, Protestantism recognizes, in that sense, the Holy Trinity, but the idea is that here the works are disputed. That's the validity of what humanity can do to save itself is disputed. And it's unsurprising that, say, Protestantism, just like Arianism back in the day, was anti-imperial, right? Was properly clashing against the sole center of the world, namely Rome and her empire. And Arianism was very strong at this point, by the way, and many Alans as well, many Germans in particular, were already this, and many emperors, also Arian emperors, in fact, were accompanied by these bodyguards because they also partly shared that kind of countercultural ethos, which was a sort of provocation dictated, by the way, by quite contingential political issues. For example, Gratian was very much notorious for that. Hilary, an aristocrat with a classical education, shared Martin's social background, but differed in his intellectual approach to theology, because he was a bishop and he had taken early on like a Christian path probably in the church and ecclesiastical hierarchy. The two men formed a bond. This is also very interesting because you have a soldier and a bishop, right? You have a bit also the idea of a monk and a secular clergyman, which will continue historically, including in the transcendental asceticism of the war bands of the knightly units, like during the Middle Ages. Martin's military background, however, at least according to the geography, which is very interesting because later there would be some commixtions also, properly military life for the bishops themselves, for that matter. But this is different because it's part of a secular militia that evidently was very important to the point, in fact, of barring the St. Martin from the priesthood, as the church often viewed at this point soldiers as tainted by violence, but more than else, in fact, connected with military cults that aligned with at least an antagonistic or not fully embraceable ecclesiastical connection, right? And this in this era is particularly interesting, given that the church was not really very fresh from persecution, because actually it was like half a century that didn't happen anymore. But right, it was still likely this kind, and at least according, in fact, to the geography that is, however, contemporary. In fact, Martin declined a diaconate at this point. It was offered at least to be within the church in some ways, thus not ordained as a priest, choosing instead a life of asceticism. In 356, Martin traveled to Illyricum to convert his parents, succeeding with his mother, who embraced Christianity. It is true that Christianity spread earlier among women. This is really typical in much of geographical history, but not his father, whose adherence to Roman religion likely reflected the social and political ambitions, other than also a quite plausible spiritual and staunch belief. Illyricum, a stronghold of Arianism, by the way, under imperial patronage, in part exactly because it was, again, very militarized, was hostile to Trinitarians that, as we've seen, believed essentially that the Son was divine. And Martin's zealous preaching provoked a public whipping and expulsion. Fleeing to Milan, he faced further persecution from the Arian bishop Auxentius, who ejected him from the city. Martin retreated to Gallinaria, an island in the Ligurian Sea, where he lived as a hermit alongside a virtuous priest. Subsisting on herbs and roots, he faced a near-fatal poisoning with hellebore, a toxic plant, but recovered through fervent prayer, testament to his resilience and faith. Basically, he entered this dimension. This is still the initiatic phase. It is the one of intense struggle. Before also the Imperium will be manifested in the Holy Ghost. In 360, the Council of Nicaea's restoration of Trinitarian influence was another. There were multiple Nicaea's councils. Allowed Hilary to return to Poitiers, and Martin joined him in 361, establishing Ligugé on a Gallo-Roman estate. This hermitage, built on the ruins of a Roman villa, became Gaul's first monastic community, at least allegedly. There were surely others before, attracting disciples from aristocratic and humble backgrounds. Ligugé served as a base for evangelizing the rural countryside, where pre-Christian beliefs remained deeply rooted. Martin's approach was practical, using simple parables to connect with peasants, such as likening a shorn sheep to Christian charity. He systematically destroyed pre-Christian temples, which before we said wasn't quite happening too forcefully, but it was actually happening in mostly through superimposition, replacing them in fact with churches and hermitages that would have, as a whole, maintained great part of their spiritual and metaphysical meaning for those who also eventually allowed this to happen, because Christianity, by the way, wasn't even yet the official religion of the empire. And it's not like these guys now were simply supported, backed by secular authority. So if this happened, it's because the local communities allow this. He did face resistance also often, but he managed to compel respect through his humility and miracles, which were in fact the winning card here. And we have to understand, in fact, what this power that was already manifest, as we've seen in the army, by defeating the Alammani consisted in. It's in 371 that Martin was consecrated Bishop of Tours because of his essentially saintly aura that was recognized through these deeds. We'll see now. He succeeded Lidoire through ruse by the townspeople who lured him from Ligouget under the pretense of aiding a sick person. Reluctant to accept the episcopal throne, by the way, because of, again, also there the deep metaphysical implications that this constituted. It's a sort of not coming back and sort of like, am I fit for that? This was, again, a guy who was an elite knight, right? So just think about the magnitude of his moral concerns, of his spiritual fight, right? And he allegedly hid among G's, whose cackling betrayed him, a story later tied to his iconography at the feast of St. Martin's Day. Why the G's? We know that, well, the G's were, especially also in this Celtic world, it was quite sensitive to that, the symbol of this is present also on the Arapakis in Rome and so on, part of the Augustum, think about the Capitol Hills, Juno's creatures. They were considered as flying above to the heavens, disappearing, in fact, for half of the year during their migration, a bit like the Night of the Swan, right? And so the idea here, in a very Christianly adulterated fashion, is that actually St. Martin ascended to his episcopal status because this sacred birds revealed him, and he was probably surrounded by, so accompanied by. This is a sort of a Lohengrin of his time, even though, again, here the geography tries a bit to hide this. And I can't stress how intense, we've seen it again in the video about Montjoie, Saint-Denis, how intense these beliefs were at the time and how continuous they would be in the following centuries within the Christian notion as well. Consecrated on July the 4th, Martin's appearance, marked by a coarse clothing, a shorn head, and self-imposed privations, drew criticism even from other bishops who favored the polished demeanor of urban clergy. In fact, these were all Gallo-Roman senators that had turned into bishops. And this is very, in fact, indicative of what also the later Frankish world will be about, enormously powerful, also militarized bishops for that matter. Yet, Martin's humility and miracles captivated Tours' citizens, who saw him as a living apostle, the messenger. That's what apostolic means. And so the carrier of the Holy Ghost. And actually the Imperium, that was the point. So the counter-altar to the more degenerate earthly rule. Martin founded Marmoutier, a monastery 3 kilometers northeast of Tours, on a cliff along the Loire River. The monks, many from aristocratic families, lived in poverty there. Prayer, apostolic, imitation, obviously some dwelling in caves carved into the riverbank. This would have been scandalous, by the way, for the time, because literally like those incredibly rich aristocratic Gallo-Roman senators and bishops' families were incredibly, first of all, they had a very secular life. They had children. They were still, again, simply recognized, and there were many issues, again, in the church already at the time, but it would also remain by practice for a long time. And it's what we were saying before for the Saint Martin or Saint Francis is the fact that there was an expectation to that. And if anything, these guys would have eventually continued also in the higher echelons of the clergy. It's completely normal to have this phase of initiation, a bit like in the war band, isolated out there in the wilderness. That's the same identical thing. Here the geography wants to stress mostly how the fake Christians were shocked, like the ones who thought only about earthly goods. But the concept behind this was also the same. It's also generational. This were the youth. And the story is that they would have, of course, made excellent bishops later, abbots and so on, given Martin's Holy Ghost that arrived to them in the process. Marboutier became a missionary hub, training clergy who spread Christianity into Gaul's countryside, where pre-Christian practices like tree worship and animal sacrifice persisted. This naturally was also intended in a truly paganistic sense of the term, so a fractal, chthonic, superstitious reality that basically worshipped literally lesser beings, as opposed to realize that the inherent potential of mankind, right, of the sacred virility. And so exchanging older symbolism of divinity for a superstitiously material object of worship. And again, it's not like specific shrines and even specific animals weren't symbolizing there also in Christianity, divinity and saints and so on. They're actually very frequent. Geography develops, especially here, especially when late antiquity was still alive, the city was the center and so on. That's where the contrast was more highlighted. But say by the early Middle Ages, there's of course a very rural geography that is also beautiful to read. It's probably one of the most beautiful literary genres. It's too bad that people don't read it, also because they contain all the pre-Christian beliefs that continued during Christianity in the symbolisms and the original connections. Like as we're seeing here with the G's, for example. You say, oh, what a silly story. If you know what the symbolism of the G's was and how, in that sense, Martin manifested, you can see behind, say, the patina of Christian adulteration, what that actual meaning really was. It was much more solemn and ancestral than it seemed. Because these same people believe in that. It's not like, this is the point that it's really important to get here. It's not like these people switched to Christianity as a cult that had nothing to do with this tradition. They were the same identical tradition, except, again, it was believed that Christ had accomplished it in a Catholic sense, as opposed to a world that was degenerating, starting to degenerate at that point because of the lack of, in fact, the holder of an absolute power. It's similar to what Buddhism was born for, or Zoroastrianism, and the meanings, especially the strictly anthropological, symbological, archetypal one, were literally the same. There was no fracture in that sense. It was a fracture in the way certain cultural forms were properly allowed and or practiced. But there wasn't a fracture in terms of the universal meaning of the same. We have created this fake split for which, again, Christianity is this external thing injected in a place that never heard any of that. They were continuing the same universal beliefs. But with that pinch of greater spiritual absolute that Christianity demanded of the earthly authority in order to be worthy of God, because things had gone down, in case you have not noticed. Martin established a rudimentary parish system, visiting the parishes annually on foot, donkey, or boat, extending his influence to Chartres, Paris, Autun, Vienne, and beyond. On foot, there's something that strains, let's say, the physique per se. It's a humble form going, like for somebody habituated to go on horseback as a knight. The donkey, as you know, is the symbol of actually the darkest, some of the darkest chthonic Dionysian elements, a bit like the snake. And this is all associated with Christ in the same Gospels, and Christ explains that's basically the antidote. If you are not afraid to basically humiliate yourself in a merely physical sense, to realize that this world is just an illusion, right? And that all what you even perceive about yourself, it's something much bigger and transcendental that does not know fear in the flesh, etc. You can achieve divinity. The boat is the usual thing of saved from the water. As we've seen, there is even a connection with Jesus. He tours the entire Gaul, as you see here. I also made a video about traveling medieval France, pilgrimage in medieval France, if you're interested. Well, that's basically the same, because we talked also about late antiquity, so the Gallo-Roman period there. Martin's evangelization targeted mostly the rural communities, whom he addressed with, as we've seen, parables drawn from their daily lives, such as the cycle of sowing and reaping to explain divine judgment. He destroyed different temples with methodical precisions, often provoking confrontations. And in one village, the locals agreed to fell a sacred pine if Martin stood in its path. He did so, and the tree miraculously missed him, prompting mass conversions. So that basically the same foundation of the world as trees were understood also for these local communities, because, I don't know, as the great oak of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus was considered by the Romans the center of the world in that sense, as much as, I don't know, the Irminsul, the Yggdrasil, and so on in Germanic tradition. Here, the fact that the miracle witnessed like this solitary tree that surely had a power and a dignity, essentially bowing to the saint, reveals his actual superiority, his actual power. Therefore, his approach, let's say, combined spiritual authority with practical engagement, earning him the trust of the same rural communities in an era in which also, in fact, the urban world was declining and the countryside was ever more important, and as we've seen, also tormented with plunders due to the invasion and so on. It was not over for gold as far as that was concerned. Martin's miracles, chronicled by Sulpicius in the Vita, in the letters and the dialogues, and later elaborated by Paulinus of Périgueux, Venantius Fortunatus, and Gregory of Tours, underscored his apostolic authority. These are all, St. Martin is the patron of Gaul, and all these Gallic authors will develop further his story. Martin's acts performed after his military service echoed the miracles of Christ and the apostles, demonstrating divine favor and spiritual power. In an Indian village of the Carnutas, a mother presented her deceased son, crying, "We know that you are a friend of God. Restore me, my son, who is my only one." Martin knelt in prayer, surrounded by a weeping crowd, and raised the boy to life, handing him to his mother. The villagers, awestruck, acknowledged Christ and sought baptism, abandoning their idols. Just think about that. In Claudio Magus, a virgin took straw from Martin's bed as a relic, hanging it around a possessed person's neck, instantly expelling the demon. In the Carnutas city, a 12-year-old girl, mute from birth, spoke her father's name after Martin blessed oil and poured it on her mouth, a miracle witnessed by bishops Valentinus and Victricius, who spread its fame. Evangelization, a Christian entangled in secular affairs, was healed of a grave illness before Martin's arrival, meeting him halfway, a testament to the saint's power to heal from a distance. The point is, could soldiers do that, right? And so the idea is that there is a transcendental way to restore life as opposed to taking it, even though, and we'll talk about this if anything better in another video, there is properly a path, the one where the fire of death blazes, that Martin would have experienced in the army, evidently enough, that entailed that even a sacrifice was necessary in order to achieve this. And so a sacrifice of life, as a matter of fact. The idea is that Martin's own life is doing so, right? And so the sacrifice, it stems actually from the capacity of Martin, but also his dedication, his devotion. As we've seen, Martin had also been whipped, persecuted, so he had actually bled himself, as he would have not been scared to do after having tried the army for that matter. Martin's authority extended over nature in the spiritual realm, reflecting his transformation from an imperial soldier to a soldier of Christ. During a journey, he encountered a demonic cow, symbol, of course, of some chthonic feminine dimension, prone to goring passers-by, by the way. Raising his hand, he commanded, "In the name of Christ, I order you to depart." The demon fled, and the cow knelt before him, restored to docility. Remember Virgilian's eclogue, the transfiguration of the entire creation, not just of humanity, but of the entire world. And of course, probably the inversion of this demonic foe. In another instance, Martin ordered huntsmen's dogs to cease chasing a hare, and he stood as if bound, allowing the animal to escape, which seems some sort of metaphor for, let's say, the wolf pack, right, of the war band. And so the idea that way of life, for how brutally sacrificial it is not enough, right? It's not like it's not actually leading somewhere. I mean, how many predators, could have actually killed that hare themselves? But there is a way to save, a way to spare, right, and to augment. During a sea storm, so the forces of Aqua, of Na, we've made just a video about Indo-European theology on that, an Egyptian merchant invoked Martin's god, and the tempest stilled, ensuring a safe voyage. These are also like things happening abroad. At Emperor Maximus' court in Trier, a queen, inspired by Martin's sanctity, served him with profound humility, preparing his meal, offering water for his hands, and cherishing his crumbs above imperial banquets. This was also a pretty sort of Celto-Germanized reality. The Queen Maximus also was of barbarian ancestry. When barred from Emperor Valentinian's palace by Arian influence, Martin fasted for 7 days, and an angel opened the gates. The imperial gates, the one that would have been guarded by the Scole Palatine, by the way. When Valentinian refused to rise, fire enveloped his throne, the sacred fire, the eternal fire, the one sung by the entire tradition, the one of Vesta, the one of the Aria, compelling compliance and granting Martin's requests for clemency. Martin's miracles often carried symbolic weight, as you have quickly realized, reinforcing his spiritual authority further. During a sacrifice, a fiery globe appeared above his head, witnessed by a virgin, a presbyter, and 3 monks, signifying his sanctity in the presence of divine light. This naturally was understood as a form of transfiguration as well, because that's also what literally the Christian miracle of it looks like. In a parish visit, a fire kindled to warm his lodging burst through a decayed floor, engulfing the room. Martin, initially struggling with the bolted door, turned to prayer, and the flames parted around him, transforming into a dewy refreshment, allowing him to emerge unscathed. So in other words, he was like Mucius Scaevola, so to say, immune to fire, right? He dominated all elements. We've seen how, in order to achieve divinity, you must pass through in the sense, the sacred waters that are turned, right, with Christian blessing, in this case, from the symbol of utmost darkness to the one of actual light, and one that allows, also in here, the human Martin not to be burned, like subject to the laws of the fall. Blessed oil sent to Avicenus's wife overflowed its jar, sign of divine abundance. Another vessel of his blessed oil fell from a high window, but landed unbroken on marble pavement, as if cushioned by divine hands. This is yet another famously recurring theme in especially late antique and even more early medieval geography, because people did not have much to eat. Oil was considered very nutritious in this sense. There's this sense of saving, that minimal surplus, barely above subsistence level that the poor lived in at the time, too much forgotten, especially, again, in late antiquity. Most people were basically working as colonists / serfs, and some greater landowners, latifundia, right? Especially in Gaul, by the way, that would also largely remain like that throughout most of the Middle Ages. A barking dog was silenced in Martin's name, and a serpent swimming toward his bank retreated at his command. Of course, acknowledging Martin's authority over creation, probably rejecting the lowest forms of this world, including probably the snake that rots the roots of the world. At Easter, Martin instructed Diacon Cato to cast a net yielding an enormous pike, echoing Christ's miracle of the fish. this is also not a random miracle, because the pike was incredibly costly at the time. As we just said, here you see not much money around, but natural goods. And so this precious, sort of juicy, fat pike that was a royal gift. In the 13th century, Saint Louis in Burgundy, I think, was gifted with a pike by some monks, if I don't remember wrongly. It was truly a royal miracle. Martin's hand adorned with gems during a sacrifice shone with purple light, a divine sign witnessed by Arborius, a former governor turned monk. Martin's spiritual encounters were frequent and profound. He conversed with angels, Agnes, Thecla, and Mary, who appeared to him in visions, affirming his sanctity. He rebuked demons by name, identifying Mercury as troublesome and Jupiter as dull. A direct challenge to at least the pre-Christian deities revered by his father's generation. We can imagine, again, this is a specific hagiographic addition by Sulpicius Severus and others that wanted essentially to properly ban any other sort of multi-deity reference as opposed to God in a biblical sense. But as we've seen, Montjoie Saint-Denis ipso facto invalidates this. The Mount of Jupiter is there, and it perfectly aligns, in fact, also with the Christian Mount of Joy, in an enormous amount of places all across the West, up to very late in times, for the battle cry being written down fully fledged, like in the 12th century, and with a constant strain connecting it to these times. An angel revealed the decrees of a synod at Nemausus, today's Nîmes, which Martin refused to attend, confirming his divine insight into distant events. In a village plagued by annual hail, his prayers shielded the region for 20 days until his death, a miracle that protected crops and sustained rural communities. They're always a bit at the center of this. A grand idol temple in a village of the Ambazienses was razed by a storm after Martin's night of prayer. This was the place, by the way, where his unit was stationed. And a massive idol pillar was crushed by a heavenly column, fulfilling his command through divine intervention, which naturally is heavenly in nature, while the idol is just of the lower nature. A woman with an issue of blood touching Martin's garment in faith was instantly healed, her recovery mirroring the gospel account of the hemorrhaging woman. Martin's compassion manifested in practical acts that resonated with rural and urban communities alike. In a nobleman's home, he blessed a cup of wine, which overflowed, nourishing the poor and demonstrating divine generosity. This is the concept of augmentation, right? This Sebastocratic capacity to create more out of the apparent nowhere, because it came from the higher nature. Check out my video about being and becoming. That is quite eloquent about that. Martin's restored sight to a blind man by anointing his eyes with blessed water, a miracle that echoed Christ's healings. When a fire threatened a parish church, Martin stood before it praying, and the flames diverted, sparing the structure in a manner reminiscent of Moses parting the sea. He calmed the stampeding herd of wild boars, allowing villagers to pass safely, their gratitude turning to faith. The boar, by the way, was also the symbol of priesthood for that matter. So, as we've seen, there were some bishops that were not up to that. And so the idea that that specific animal could be tamed actually aligns not just with sort of the counter-altar represented by Martin's episcopate, but also the fact that there was a traditional way in seeing the defeat of the boar as the victory of the warrior, actually. And so the warrior cased, at that point, the first estate, crushing the priesthood that did not make it to victory. This was an important symbolism as well, underscoring actually the Imperial Catholic traditional heritage of also the Christian version of it. Martins healed a leper in Tours by embracing him. This is typical. If you go for exactly what is going to expectedly annihilate you because you truly don't have fear, you will actually succeed, metaphysically speaking. We are mortal only because we are scared of death, right? Martin's touch restored the man's skin and inspired conversions among onlookers. In a dispute between two brothers over land, Martin prayed, and a spring emerged, resolving their conflict and providing a lasting resource, a miracle that addressed temporal needs through divine intervention. Martin's evangelization transformed rural Gaul, founding parishes in Langeais, Sonnay, Amboise, Charnissé, Tournon, and Candes. Martin's understanding of rural life, its cycles of planting and harvest, its reliance on natural forces, enabled effective preaching. It's an eminently peasantly message, a rural one. Martin's used parables, as we've seen, drawn from agrarian life, such as likening a shorn ship to evangelical share, or a fruitful vine to spiritual growth to connect with peasants. In one village, a crowd attempted to kill him before demolishing their temple, but the divine light halted their attack, prompting repentance. In a village of the Edwy, he restored a well during a drought, providing water and inspiring faith among the locals. At his monastery's gate, a possessed person was cured with Martin's touch, the demon fleeing at his approach. During exorcisms, demons confessed their names, tortured by his presence alone, a power that echoed Christ's authority over unclean spirits. In one instance, a possessed woman and child were freed from demonic torment as Martin entered their village, their recovery prompting communal conversion. So these acts, recorded by Sulpicius Severus, positioned Martin as a spiritual warrior, his military discipline redirected towards combating evil. It's also very interesting to look at the geographical dimension. We mentioned the Ed, we made a video about them, for example. You can understand also there how they actually thought power and the relation with humanity, and why the rise of these saints in a moment of great sort of moral disorder and darker years seemed to be the true answer for the communities that had ever more faith in the possibility of transcending this terrible times. In 385, Martin intervened in the Priscillianist controversy at Trier, pivotal moment of his episcopal career. There is also, in fact, this more ecclesiastical conciliar intervention, more out there in the arena. Priscillian, an ascetic bishop accused of heresy for his extreme practices, faced execution after Bishop Ithasius appealed to Emperor Maximus. Martin, joining Ambrose of Milan, the saint converter of St. Augustine, by the way, opposed secular punishment for doctrinal disputes, arguing that excommunication, not death, was the church's prerogative. This is incredibly important. Higher justice would always be entrusted to the earthly authority. This is incredibly important. By the way, it shows you, with St. Ambrose, you have the true Christianization of the Roman Empire, not just because of Theodosius, but properly because of the full backing that Ambrose, that, by the way, came from Trier, as you know, just eventually be the Bishop of Milan. And so there is St. Martin's connection. Think about even these people will be able to rise, first of all, from a bureaucratic statesman background, right, to confer properly this full organic vision of the empires, fully backed by Christianity and fully protecting Christianity. I just recently made a video about Emperor Theodosius. Just think that these are the same people we're discussing. You see how everything entwines. We also addressed, for example, the matter of capital punishment that could not be administered by the church in its tribunals, and so you needed at least a lay advocate. We've seen it in medieval Germany for the ministeriales, for example, but it was really a thing for any sort of lay lord locally, cited by the ecclesiastical one. You see here the deep conviction, even as a Greisel veteran in arms, in earthly arms, that in that sense, death penalty was useless. It was something not even meant just for somebody else, but in a sense for those who would fall, who would incur in the limit of needing to kill in order to resolve and not being able to manifest, in fact, the miracles that to carry out, to perform the miracles that the Saint Martins did. Martin thus secured leniency for Priscillian's followers. They were heretic, by the way, but Maximus, under pressure from other bishops, ordered Priscillian's beheading. And so you see that the lay authority that basically screws up, and Maximus will also fall, as you know, against Theodosius's also wind of full Christianization together with Ambrose. So you understand the entwining there. And this is, by the way, at least one of the first instances of execution for heresy in Christian history. Grieved by this outcome, Martin refused communion with Ithasius until coerced by Maximus, a decision that sparked suspicions of heresy against him. His stance, rooted in a commitment to mercy, led him to avoid episcopal assemblies, yet his influence endured through Marmontier's monks, who maintained ties with imperial courts, reflecting the growing alliance between Christian bishops and political power. Martin's miracles continued to reflect his soldierly resolve, now transformed into spiritual warfare. When soldiers, for example, beat him for startling their mules, he endured in silence. I mean, this is one that would have been able to literally and technically know how to slaughter the soldiers themselves, right? But he let himself being beaten. The mules stood then immovable until the soldiers sought for Martin's forgiveness, a miracle that humbled earthly force and that revealed how the same soldiers could be converted again to realize that the futile violence against here like a defenseless man that chose, however, to be defenseless in that case. He could have not just killed them in a soldierly way, but he could have literally destroyed them by divine force, at least had he misused it, and that would have surely brought him troubles, rather. In another instance, Martin's mere intent healed a possessed person before physical contact, and his prayers drove demons from a monk, Brictio, who repented after attacking him. Lecontius, a lieutenant, sought Martin's aid for his diseased household, and after 7 days of fasting, Martin restored them, dedicating their offered silver to captives' redemption. Thinking even about probably the idea of spending this for those who were captured. And the military background here is, you see, repeating itself. It's not like Martin stopped caring about the world. That's not what monks do, right? It's actually trying to fix all the problems, including within the military, that he too well knew. Martin's spiritual oversight extended to rebuking a monk's improper behavior from afar, preserving monastic sanctity. In one village, a non-Christian attempted to kill him with a sword, but the blade turned to dust. That turns out useful in battle, right? And that's why he didn't need even to show that. But showing it to those who wanted to understand why that was used, not in battle, but to save the others, because this power would have not been, in part, like Martin's powers were limited, but there was something more genuine about these miracles manifesting where you wouldn't think they would manifest, like in a massive holy combat showdown, to prove that even that enormous display of earthly power, in the forms in which it was manifested, in fact, could be bypassed by something so simpler and effective. And that's also what the message of Christianity is at the end of the day. Also in terms of sheer force, these are not two different sources of power. The same power of those warriors came from God, right? But this power, this way to it, was much more difficult to achieve and much more powerful in outcome. And at that point, in fact, the ascendant sought baptism, awestruck by divine protection. As Martin aged, his commitment to the Church's unity remained unwavering. In 397, at 60 or 81. Again, as we said before, we may think that he had 25 years of service in the army. We don't know when he was actually born. But in any case, even 60 for especially an ex-soldier was a feat for those times. Martin then traveled, if we're not talking about 81 for that matter, he traveled to Kant to reconcile warring clerics, a grueling journey that tested his frail health. He succeeded in restoring peace, but succumbed to exhaustion, dying on November the 8th on a bed of ashes, a penitential practice of holy men. His body, reportedly white as snow, symbolized his purity. Tourangeau and Poitevin disputed his remains, but the former stole his body through a window, ferrying it along the Loire to Tours for burial on November the 11th in a Christian cemetery. The shrine, as you know, exists, and it's one of the most important places of cult in the West. Flowers reportedly bloomed unseasonably during the journey, inspiring the term Saint Martin's summer, which is exactly these days. I'm recording on November the 8th, by the way. As you know, the warm summer of the dead, which is a phenomenon later associated with mild autumn weather, in fact, but it was probably believed to be motivated by, in fact, like anything, by these divine forces. I talked about very much like the afterlife in that video about medieval pilgrimage in France. We talked about the power of relics, and we talked about St. Martin's. And we have seen how the continuity of life, we were talking about it, for example, the other day in the video about Pictish stones symbolism. There's literally like the symbol of a rod of lightning that at some point flowers. All right, and the symbol is clear. It's the Holy Ghost coming from especially the double disc in Pictish iconography, from the higher nature to the latter, giving life, extending life, further life, as Martin had done in his earthly one, and after his mortal persona dissolved, his soul went to heaven to create this bridge, like with the firmament, and so the source of actual life. This was really believed for all saints, and as much as it was believed, in fact, for the former saints that were mostly warriors, and that, as you know, think about, I don't know, the tumuli, also in Ireland, of eventually who became saints during Christianization, and who is Martin, if not a warrior, the warrior per excellence, not a metaphorical warrior, but actually the most brutal professional soldier that you can imagine in the Roman army at the time, literally achieving this also in a hyper metaphysical sense. It's incredibly important, and also speaking volumes probably about the passage in the moral shift that we talked about in a specific video title like this, from, in fact, the paradigm shift from pre-Christian to Christian empire in particular. Because you see, he was just reaching heaven more successfully here than what he had done as a soldier, as a young man, believing that he could attain that simply through that way. That is not to say that can be attained. It can be attained also through that. But there is a way that is much more numinous, much more sort of unnecessarily... Think about Augustus, that was actually pretty scarce as a soldier, but the notion is that he actually superseded that just out of sheer divine power, was recognized also by his political enemies, much as Caesar, that, well, was a bit more of a military guy, to say the least. But still, right? Now, Bishop Brictus built a wooden chapel over Martin's tomb in 437, replaced by Perpetuus' Grand Basilica in 470, a structure with 120 marble columns that became a major pilgrimage site, to say the least. Martin's cloak, venerated as a relic in Marmoutier's oratory, inspired the term chapel from kappa, that is the cloak, the chlamydus, as we've seen before, interestingly enough. Probably there is something to close to in terms of the pure light. Also think about the Gothic symbolism of the same church structure that is pure life and pure power. So the chapel itself is this shrine, veritable shrine, literally shrouded in a sacred cloak, and so in the Holy Ghost, as a matter of fact. Remember what the chlamydia symbolized, by the way. And this relic was carried into battle by Merovingian kings, by the way. Cross Rising in Blood is the title of one of my earliest and most successful videos, but if you're interested about the sacralization of the Merovingian monarchy, that was very much hematophilic and very much, in fact, chasing this boundary between like the war band bloody practices and in fact the bloody passion of Christ. There are beautiful hymns probably written insisting on the blood. It was a particularly Frankish thing. It derived from the human sacrifices they kept performing for a while. Also for Pope Gregory the Great, that was evangelizing the Anglo-Saxons, so was not shocked by anything. Still complained about at the beginning of the 7th century. This is incredibly important because, again, the military knightly tradition of Martin lives on in this. It's not merely the Christian meek whatever. It's actually a fearful Numan that also owed much for having surpassed being the knightest of the knight, so to say. And this cemented, in fact, Martin's role as a patron of the Frankish monarchy under Clovis and the Carolingians. Gallo-Roman and later probably Frankish-French imperial mystique is enormous. You have literally these shrines containing those giant mountains that we understood also in Saint-Denis with the Oriflamme, where the same monarch were sacred, right? Curing leprosy, for example, was, as we've seen, a prerogative of Martin, but also of the later French king. So they believed to be of the same mold, exactly because this was a military thing. Think about St. Olaf of Norway, think about St. Oswald of Northumbria. It's really there at this point in history, quite prepotently explicitated. It's not a fracture. It's all one with the military legacy. And St. Martin's military capacity and experience is all one with his later more sort of otherworldly spiritual power manifest in this fallen world. And thus, Martin's legacy endured through his miracles and institutions. Gregory of Tours, the greatest early medieval writer of Gaul, writing in the 6th century, noted that Martin's tomb, adorned with a marble slab by Bishop Euphronius, drew pilgrims seeking healing and intercession, which means that the power attained by those who know how to use this word can be turned also to help the poorest. This is literally what St. Martin's does by cutting with his spada the calamities to give it to the poor. So this is incredibly important because it's developing a proto-feudal and seigneurial mentality. We've seen it in videos like Gérard de Aurillac, that is literally the case of a lay saint, so a knight, literal knight that is saint at the same time. He doesn't even have to abandon his lordship and his military life. We are in the 10th century, it's a bit different socially speaking. At this point of Martin, there is the great contrast between Christianity and the previous way to Catholicism and all the various heresies as we've seen, so it's different. But it evolves along the same path. All right. It's a bit like when during the Roman decursio, imperial funeral, the equites threw, like Martin could have done in theory, at least in the older ways, their own decorations on the pyre as an eagle was unleashed, that symbolizing the deified soul of the emperor. That was the medium, the auspice of all this military accomplishment because of the Sacrum Imperium. And so here, right, Martin remits his military power to God entirely because he steps up equally, right? Perpetuus St. Basilica, with its gilded roof and vast atrium, amplified Martin's cult, which spread across Europe with churches dedicated to him in Italy, Germany, Hungary, his actual native land, Spain, and Britain. Venantius Fortunatus declared, quote, "Wherever Christ is known, Martin is honored." This is beautiful, right? Moving, reflecting Martin's universal veneration. Martin is one of the greatest souls in European history, right? The magnanimitas intended probably in the older, we explained in the European etymology of that term. You see how also modernization, secularization has weakened. People would say it's also Christianity, but Christianity actually knew the original meaning already of these words. Magnanimity. To us, a magnanimous person is just like, I don't know, a person who makes a favor to someone who shouldn't. Magnanimitas in antiquity meant, the capacity to encompass the whole universe with your soul because you dominate it entirely. This is exactly what the saints are able to do, to create a cohesive culture in Latin Germanic Europe, in this case also with this pinch of Celtic background, natural, that will essentially keep together a civilization, also in spiritual terms. And as you know, on Schwerpunkt we make really lots of videos about this comparison, showing how the West here had a lot to say, contrary to the myth of a sort of weird barbarian world that people like to somehow imagine for some strange reason. And we really look at a giant of, still we could argue, of our times. And there is something about the cloak of St. Martin, conserved in the royal treasury by 679, becoming a banner from Frankish kings, its keepers called capellani. And remember this, that not just the etymology of chapel, kappa, but the fact that this banner was of Frankish kings was a calamitous of an imperial elite cataphract bodyguard of Julian that was given like as one of the greatest sort of purest clothes of the time to help the poor, and stressing in this sense the necessity for also, for example, the Frankish imperial grandeur to conquer the world by protecting it at the same time. Because you don't just enter the world by fighting, by spilling blood, like in Martin's case, like he would have literally done, realistically, as a soldier in that situation, but also actually compacting, preserving what was sanctioned, what was established as an imperium, because without the decisive moral majority, and so the spiritual favor of the Holy Ghost passing also through the people from God, you cannot rule anywhere, right? And the fact that, by the way, the Merovingian world was so replete with such relics and mystique is also part of the reason why also through the Carolingian Empire it became the unifier of Europe in broader moral, cultural terms also to this day. After Rome, and actually, as I explained in a recent video about the manifestation of the Roman Imperium, presaged by Clovis and achieved by Charlemagne in Italy, really upholding the greatest Roman tradition through this truly Catholic heroes, warriors, saints, right? This video is quite important because I've always really liked the figure of Martin since I was little, and I think that it's just very, very few would have just done. Like, I'm probably the only person talking about this online, but we could talk so much more about Martin's accomplishment, reading properly the sources and so on. It probably won't happen very soon. But there is something about this tradition that shows you how much of the continuity of the previous era is concerned, and how much this arrives straight to us. This is the beauty of it as well, and it should be never forgotten. As much as you can easily relate to it, it's something familiar after all, and yet it also opens this sort of world this window on a world that people often talk about, but they don't know what it is. They're fascinated with how was pre-Christian Europe, and starting to realize that we are the same people, right? And that we believe in the same things, just by different degrees. And that this all teaches us how much power is in our hands, I think, is truly incredible, truly majestic, and truly empowering in turn. That's the reason why we will surely make more videos about this topics, and why the whole thing I think is really, really relevant and really important as a whole. All right. So, what to say here? Surely there is much more to do, but I guess today's video is okay. We'll also make more Gallo-Roman content, because it seems that it's really a very cool topic that deserves really a great consideration. There are so many important figures that just we mentioned here today that are worth videos from the times and places. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.